We left off in chapter 10 when the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle and the Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai and traveled from place to place until the cloud came to rest in the desert of Paran. Finally, at long last, they begun the 2-week journey to the promised land. Unfortunately, as we already mentioned, that 2-week journey is going to turn into a journey that takes almost 40 years. Something begins to happen in chapter 11, which turns the tide of God's favor and derails the people from his promise. What happens? Give you one good guess. You guessed it, complaining. Numbers chapter 11, verse 1 says, "Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said." Chapter 10 tells us they had literally been on their journey for 3 days, and already they were focused on what they didn't have. The important part, however, is the second half of the sentence. The Lord heard everything they said. Have you ever seen a politician or a public figure say something that they didn't want everybody to know, something that put them in a bad light? They didn't know that somebody had an open mic somewhere and was recording what they were saying. We got to remember that with God, the mic is always on. He hears everything. And he doesn't just sit there. He responds. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, we see a simple command. Do everything without complaining or arguing. The Israelites were literally walking in supernatural provision. I mean, think about it. They had the visible presence of God with them by day in the form of a cloud, and by night in the form of a pillar of fire. The food they ate miraculously appeared on the ground every morning, and they had already seen more miracles than they could count on their fingers. Yet they complained because circumstances were not ideal. 1 Timothy 6:6 tells us that godliness with contentment is great gain. But these people were not content to trust God, even after all he'd done for them. And God judged them harshly, and some of them lost their lives. So they traveled on for exactly 3 seconds and started complaining again. We skip down to verse 4 and we read, "Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave," check this out, "the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain." Now, first of all, who was this foreign rabble that the Bible talks about? Well, Exodus chapter 12, verse 38 tells us that people who were not children of Abraham joined the Israelites on their exodus from Egypt. The foreigners started complaining, and then the Israelites followed. Freedom Church, please do not travel closely with those who do not share in your covenant. They will not lead you into faith. What's more, they'll lead you into foolishness. Now, what were they craving? What were they complaining for? The good things of Egypt. Fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Pretty much everything to give you bad breath, right? They literally said these words. They said, "Back in Egypt, we sat around pots of meat." Are you kidding me? They started forgetting how it used to be, how bad it was in slavery. They started talking about the good old days. You know what the good old days are? The good old days are a combination of a good imagination and a bad memory. That's what the good old days are. And they not only complained about what they didn't have, but they complained about the manna that God had provided. They said they were sick of it. So God sent quail. So many quail that they filled the sky and covered the ground. And then they ate meat until they were sick of it. Something to think about here. God wanted to send them meat. Really, think about that. God wanted to send them meat. If he didn't want to, he wouldn't have done it. Because they complained, he sent so much meat that it was a burden to them. And he also sent a plague to deal with those who had originally complained. What do you think might have happened if they had said something more along the lines of this? God, we thank you for what you've done for us, how you've rescued us from slavery, and you provided water in the wilderness and food every day. We're grateful for all you've done. We would like some meat, though. Would you please send us some? Nevertheless, your will be done, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity that you've shown us. I promise you, Freedom Church, if they would have had a grateful heart, the end of the story would have been way different. But they didn't have a grateful heart, and the complaining spread through the camp. In Numbers chapter 12, the complaining even spread to Moses' brother and sister. Numbers 12, verse 1, it says, while they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he had married a Cushite woman. They said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? But the Lord heard them. Now, who was this wife? Some people think it was Zipporah, but we know that Zipporah was a Midianite woman. This woman was a Cushite, which is also called an Ethiopian. For whatever reason, they were complaining about her, but obviously they were just finding fault with Moses, because the real point was, hey, we're just as good as Moses. Hasn't God spoken through us also? And once again, the Lord heard it. And he just didn't sit by and let it happen. God responded. He called all three of them to the tabernacle and he said, hey, when I speak to a prophet, I reveal myself through visions and dreams, but not with Moses. Of all my house, he's the one I trust. I speak to him face to face. So why weren't you afraid to criticize my servant Moses? With that, the Lord ascended back up into the heavens, and when he did, Miriam was left standing there with her skin white as snow from leprosy. As Moses stood there looking at his sister, what do you think his response was? Do you think he crossed his arms and said, now you get what you deserve? See, I told you. Nope, not Moses, because he really was a humble man, a godly man. Verse 13 tells us he immediately cried out to the Lord and said, oh God, I beg you to heal her. And God did heal her. But she was unclean because of the leprosy, and she had to remain outside of the camp for 7 days. Now in chapter 13, it's only been a short time since they started their journey, but many, many events have taken place. They started out here at Mount Sinai, and they've traveled north to the wilderness of Zin. Now the Lord tells Moses to send out men to explore the land of Canaan. He says to send one leader from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, of these 12 men, 2 men stand out. One is named Hoshea, but Moses called him Yeshua, which means the Lord saves. The English translation of the Hebrew word for Yeshua is Joshua. And the English translation of the Greek word for Yeshua is Jesus, the Lord saves. Jesus and Joshua were both named Yeshua. The other special man is Caleb from the tribe of Judah. We'll hear more about them in a minute. But those 12 men travel out from the wilderness. And into the land of Canaan to spy out the land. They spent 40 days spying out the land, and in the process, they went all the way up to Hebron, which you might remember is the town where Abraham first settled in the land of Canaan. When they returned, they reported to the community. They said, "Wow, we entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. And here's the kind of fruit it produces." They had brought back a cluster of grapes so large that it required 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. And then in verse 28, the report of the spies turned very negative. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. This is verse 30. "Let's go at once to take the land," Caleb said. "We can certainly conquer it." But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. They said, "We can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are." They're worried about those giants, aren't they? Something to think about. Faith is contagious, but so is fear. People who are controlled by fear become very narrow in their thinking. They not only limit themselves, but they try to limit others as well, based on their own fear. If you hang around them, you'll begin to think like that too. But if you hang around people who are motivated by faith, who put God first and trust Him to be their Savior and their Lord, and to provide for them in all that they need, over time, your faith will grow too. And in verse 32, we see where the real problem started. 10 of the spies, now mind you, not Joshua or Caleb, but the other 10, started to go throughout all of the Israelite camp and spread a bad report. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size." Verse 33, "We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." And hear this, "and we looked the same to them." Now, maybe they looked like grasshoppers in their own eyes, but they had no reason to believe they looked like grasshoppers to their enemy. Everybody else was looking at a big enemy. But Joshua and Caleb were looking at a big God. If you leave God out of it, then yeah, sure, the enemy was much larger than they were. But if you put the enemy next to God, then the enemy is small. It all depends on how you evaluate life. What's more, they thought they looked like grasshoppers to their enemy, but they were wrong. Now, how do we know that? Well, jump into the future with me, 38 years, to the book of Joshua, chapter 2. You don't have to turn there. We're just going to jump there in our minds. They finished their travels through the wilderness, and they are standing on the bank of the Jordan River. Moses has died, and the next leader is Joshua. Joshua leads them, and the first city they go to is Jericho. Now, there's a lady there by the name of Rahab, and Joshua sends in 2 spies, and they meet Rahab. Rahab tells them the truth. She says, "The fear of you Israelites has fallen upon all of us. Our hearts are melting in terror because of you." That's what they were really thinking. The giants and the people of Jericho were fearful of the people of God because God put terror in their hearts. Never underestimate what God can do. When He's told you to do something, He will provide for it. You think your enemy looks huge? You think the one standing between you and God's promise is immovable? You don't know what God has put into the heart of the other guy. But unfortunately, the Israelites believed the report of the 10 spies. And they started to do what? Remember, this book can be called the book of complaining. And that's what they did. They complained. In Numbers 14:1, we read, "That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, 'If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder.'" They're saying it would be better for us to die than to live this life that God has for us. They're saying God won't take care of us, and He won't take care of our children. And they're saying this after everything they've seen. The rest of chapter 14 is really worth reading on your own because it gives us some amazing insight into the heart and mind of Moses and of God. But I'm going to let you read it yourself. And we're going to skip down to verse 27, where God says, "I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say." Now remember, with God, the mic is always on, and He responds to what He hears. If you speak fear, doubt, and complaints, He'll respond accordingly. But if you speak faith and trust, He responds accordingly. Here's how God responded. "As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I'm going to bring them in to enjoy the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness." They used their children as an excuse to complain against God, and God called their bluff. They said, "If only we would have died in the desert." And God said, "You know what? I'm writing that down." He said, "Fine. You're so worried about how I take care of your children? I'm going to bring them into the land and not you. You say it would have been better to just die in the wilderness? Your wish is granted." You see, they had seen God's miracles. They had seen His faithfulness, yet they refused to trust Him. So God said they were going to wander the wilderness for 40 years until the last of them was dead. And the children that they pretended to be so worried about, they would suffer because of the parents' fear and faithlessness until the last of the parents died off and the children could be brought into the promised land. Psalms 103 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless His holy name." This guy who wrote the psalm, he's talking to himself, and he's saying, "Hey, soul, bless the Lord, and don't forget all of His benefits, how He forgives and how He heals, how He redeems your life, and He crowns you with loving kindness and tender mercies. He satisfies you with good things so that your youth is renewed." The guy writing this psalm is looking at the man in the mirror, and he's saying, "Hey, you, remember the goodness of God. Remind yourself and do not fail to remember his faithfulness to you. And that's what we have to do. We got to talk to the guy in the mirror or the gal in the mirror. And we got to say, hey, soul, bless the Lord. Remember what he's done for you. Don't let yourself forget what he's done for you. It takes effort on our part to remember the goodness of God. See, complaining comes easy. And if we're honest, there's even a sense of satisfaction that comes from complaining. But it doesn't lead us into life. God immediately struck down the 10 leaders who had spread a bad report throughout the camp. And then what do you think the Israelites did next? The very next morning, they set out to battle. They said, oh, we have sinned. Let's go up to battle and take the land that the Lord has promised us. Moses says, no, stop. I'm not going. The ark's not going. God's not going to be with you. And Moses warned them not to go. And even though neither Moses nor the Ark of the Covenant went with them, they went to battle. And they lost miserably. It's amazing to me how strongly they insisted on doing it their way, no matter what it cost them. So far, we've covered the rebellion of Aaron and Miriam, and we also covered the rebellion of the spies. And I'm happy to report to you that at long last, the Israelites have finally learned their lesson, and we're done with all the stubborn rebellion of people who want to do it their way. And now we're going to talk about the rebellion of Korah. You might not have heard of this guy, but he's even mentioned in the New Testament as someone to not be like. We call him Korah. His name in Hebrew is Korach, with the phlegm, right? If you don't produce a loogie when you say his name, then you haven't said it right. Korach, right? But in each case of rebellion that we've looked at so far, the people have been given some authority and it went straight to their head. This case is no different. But just to be fair, let's think about this, okay? Keep in mind that Moses just told them that they were no longer going to inherit the promised land, but instead they're going to die in the wilderness. I mean, that's a gut punch to anybody. It was shocking news to hear. And being the stubborn and obstinate people that they are, they set out to do something about it themselves, their way. So here comes Korah. He's a leader of the Levites, along with two men named Dathan and Abiram, who themselves were not even Levites. And these three men were leading a group of 250 other men, and they were all leaders among the people. And what's more, they were all members of the council. Now check this out. They accused Moses of appointing himself leader over the people. And they decided that they were all equal to Moses and Aaron. And as their equals, they could appoint themselves to the priesthood also. They wanted to be able to approach God in the tabernacle. They weren't satisfied with the work that God had given them. They wanted someone else's work. And here's the catch, and the honor that came with it. So Moses tells them all, okay, all of you come back tomorrow. Aaron and I will be here as well. And the Lord will choose which one that he wants to approach him. So they all came back bright and early the next morning. And check this out. Moses tells all the people, oh my goodness, you guys. He says, move away from Korah and his boys. So this guy, Moses, who made the Red Sea part so that Korah and his posse could walk through on dry ground with a wall of water on either side of them, This guy Moses, who made water flow out of a rock in the middle of a desert, right? This same Moses is now telling everybody to move away from Korah and his posse. If I was Korah right now, I'd be changing my mind because there's no way this is going to end well. As the people start backing away, listen to what Moses says in Numbers chapter 16, verse 28. Then Moses said, "This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things and that it wasn't my idea. If these men, Korah and all of his boys, if they die a natural death and they suffer the fate of all mankind, then I'm a fake. The Lord hasn't sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new," oh, and here we go. "If the earth opens its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you're going to know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." Are you kidding me? As soon as I heard Moses say, "If the earth opens its mouth and swallows them," I would have interrupted Moses. I would have torn my clothes, thrown dirt on my head, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Moses, I'm wrong. I'm wrong. Please ask God to forgive me." But not Korah and his boys. They just stood there. And as soon as Moses finished speaking, the ground opened up, swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and everything they owned, and closed back over top of them. And then fire came out from the Shekinah, the presence of the Lord, and consumed Korah's posse of 250 men. Every last thing was gone except their brass censers that Korah and his men had been using to try to burn incense before the Lord. These brass censers were still laying there in the ashes. So God directed for those censers to be hammered into sheets and overlaid on the altar in the courtyard, the altar right here where you see the fire burning. The brass sheets were overlaid on the altar in the courtyard as a reminder to the people that no one was to approach the presence of the Lord except Aaron and his descendants. If you think about it, every time the people would enter through the gate and approach the altar, every time they offered a sacrifice, they saw this new bronze overlay on the altar, and they could remember what happened. And by the way, bronze in the Old Testament is always used in reference to judgment. That'll come into play a little bit later too. So finally, after God dealt with Korah and his boys, we see the end of rebellion among the Israelites, right? No, again. Unbelievably, the very next day, the entire Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron, and they said, "You have killed the Lord's people." So God sent a plague among them, and they immediately started dropping. Aaron ran to the altar of the Lord and grabbed some coals and put them in his brass censer and ran back to the people to stop the plague, and the plague did stop. The Bible says that he stood between the living and the dead. Now, here's the point. It was God's way of telling the people, look, Aaron didn't kill your guys, and he just saved your behinds too. But God wasn't done yet. He really was trying to win the hearts of the people. He wanted them to follow him and trust him and quit complaining. So he told Moses to have the 12 leaders of each tribe of Israel bring their staff and write their name on it. Aaron did the same thing with his staff. Moses placed all 13 staffs before the Lord in the tent of the tabernacle. And then he told the people that God would choose one of the men. And the staff of the man that God chooses would sprout and begin to grow. Now, that's a miracle. Well, the next day, Moses found that Aaron's staff had not only sprouted, but had budded, blossomed, and produced almonds, all from a dead stick. Then Moses brought all the staffs out for the people to see, and each leader took his own staff. Now, please keep in mind that all of these amazing and exciting stories are taking place in the book of Numbers. Okay? This is the book that most people think is boring and hard to read. I'll admit to you that some of the book can be a little bit tedious, but the only way to get your hands on a treasure is by clearing the dirt from on top of the treasure. And just like with every other Bible study we've done, I remind you that there are many more treasures buried between the pages. We just don't have time in this Bible study for me to uncover all of them. But I hope that you find time to read them for yourself. So for today, I bring this Bible study to a close. And once again, I would like to pray over you the blessing found in Numbers chapter 6. It's the priestly blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. And with that, I conclude today's Bible study and open it for questions.